Professor Trivedi, Professor Juneja, distinguished faculty, students, and guests. I thank the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research for inviting me to give this Foundation Day lecture. I've always seen TIFR with great awe from afar, and some explanations probably in order. My roommate in my first year at MIT was Dr. Ranganathan Iyer now, who is one of the smartest mathematicians I know. He used to always help me understand my tutorials in real analysis and figure out what the answers were. And he never missed an occasion to tell me how much smarter everyone else at TIFR was than he was. So perhaps he was being modest, but I half expected on coming here today to see everyone with gigantic heads housing enormous brains. It's a relief to see that all of you outwardly at least look normal. Seriously, I think the continuing success of TIFR that we heard a little bit about from Professor Trivedi suggests to us that when India wants to set up world-class institutions, it really can. While the Institute was fortunate to have a visionary like Dr. Homi Bhabha as its founding director, the institution has been built by the collective efforts of dedicated researchers like the ones present in this room. Congratulations on a job really well done. In my speech today, I had a placeholder, economic reflections, but that doesn't mean anything. I really want to talk about our efforts to build a different kind of institution, not one that delves into the deepest realms of outer space or into the tiniest constituents of an atom, but one that attempts to control something that affects your everyday life, that is inflation. There are some parallels between the institution building that you have done here at TIFR and what we are trying to do to control inflation. Though clearly our efforts are much less tied to investigating the very fabric of the universe and more towards influencing human behavior. Ultimately, though, building institutions requires a fundamental change in mindset, and I think you've had it here, and we need to have it towards inflation. Let me argue first that high inflation has been with us for the last 4 decades in one form or the other, with a few periods intervening of relatively low inflation. Most recently, for example, we've experienced an average of more than 9% per year inflation between 2006 and 2013. So, natural question that arises is, what are the costs of having this high inflation? Now, clearly everyone understands the costs of hyperinflation when prices are rising every minute. Money is then a very hot potato that no one wants to hold, with people rushing straight from the bank to the shops to buy goods in case their money loses value along the way. And you have to read the stories of the hyperinflations to understand this kind of behavior. Now, as people lose faith in money, barter of goods for goods or services becomes the norm, making transacting significantly more difficult. For example, how much of a physics lecture would you have to pay a taxi driver to drive you to Bandra? Moreover, would the taxi driver accept a physics lecture in payment? Perhaps you would have to lecture a student and then get the student to sing to the taxi driver. So you get the point that transacting becomes very difficult because money no longer is seen as a means of exchange, and hyperinflation renders this money worthless. Hyperinflation also has redistributive effects, destroying the savings of the middle class, which are typically held in fixed income securities such as bonds and deposits. And I would urge you to read some of the books about hyperinflation in some other countries such as Austria and Germany in the 1920s, and that makes very, very scary reading. So clearly anybody who knows about this doesn't want the kind of hyperinflation we've seen in Zimbabwe and Venezuela. But what if inflation was only 15% a year? or even 10% a year, wouldn't you care? The argument often is made that countries have grown fast over a period of time despite high inflation. And therefore, perhaps, rates of inflation in double digits are bearable. The problem, of course, is when you look at growth, it's not obvious that just because you can grow fast with high inflation, you couldn't have grown faster still with lower inflation. After all, what happens with inflation is that there are costs associated with higher inflation. For example, as you go to higher levels of inflation, the variability of inflation increases with its level. So prices then get more dispersed from their fundamental value in the economy. And this makes price signals much more confusing. Is the fact that the price of my widget that I'm manufacturing going up because of high demand or because of high generalized inflation? It makes a difference which one it is. If it is high demand and I produce more, I can sell more. If it is high inflation and I produce more, I'll be left with a ton of inventory because all that's been happening is the prices have gone up, but not the underlying demand. So in a situation of high inflation, it is quite possible that production and investment become more risky. But there's also a problem from the investment side. If you have high and variable inflation, you're going to be reluctant to invest in fixed income securities because they get hit a lot if there's high inflation. So you would demand a higher interest rate to hold those fixed income securities. And that embedded in that higher interest rate is what we call the inflation risk premium, a risk premium to compensate you for the fact that you're holding fixed income securities that pay a fixed interest rate in a period when inflation is high and fluctuating. Now, this fixed interest rate makes both long-term nominal and real interest rates higher, thus making the cost of investment for projects, the financing of projects, much more costly, reducing investment. Now, these kinds of effects kick in when inflation is noticeably high. So it's legitimate to ask at what threshold level of inflation does it start hurting growth? Unfortunately, that question is hard to answer because developing countries typically have high inflation, but developing countries also typically have higher growth. And so if one sees a positive correlation between inflation and growth, doesn't mean that the inflation created the growth. They just seem to go together. So for this reason, because of this fundamental difficulty in identifying the effects of inflation, there is a vast literature on estimating threshold levels of inflation beyond which it hurts growth, but that literature is largely inconclusive. So tons of papers that don't say very much. If you sort of delve through those papers and try and get some kind of sense of what the takeaway is, you will find that generally double-digit inflation is harmful for growth. But when you come to where in the single digits is the threshold beyond which you start hurting growth, it's much harder to get agreement. Typically, for developed countries, it seems to be in the low single digits. For developing countries, it seems to be about 6 or 7%. However, despite this kind of limited evidence on where the threshold is beyond which inflation starts hurting growth, most countries set their inflation goal in the low single digits. Developed countries probably around 2%, and developing countries and emerging markets around 5%. Typically, these numbers are different from where the threshold effects are estimated. For example, developing countries between 7 to 10%. Now, why do we set it lower? 3 reasons come to mind. First, even if inflation is at a moderate level that doesn't hurt growth, the consequences of inflation are not evenly distributed. For example, higher inflation may help a highly indebted industrialist because his debt comes down relative to sales revenue. So he's inflating away his debt. And he's happy. But it hurts the poor daily wage worker whose wage is not indexed to inflation. So the daily wage worker gets hurt because he has no indexation. Industrialist gets helped. Second, higher inflation is more variable. Because it's more variable, if you set the inflation threshold, if you set the inflation goal higher, it raises the chance of breaching any given range around the target. And to that extent, if a target is higher, it will be closer to the threshold, and the probability of going past the threshold is likely to be higher. So people generally set the inflation goal where you want inflation to reach in your country, where you want to force the central bank, what target you want the central bank to meet, you want to set it significantly lower than the inflation threshold. And the third reason we don't go near the inflation threshold when we're setting the target is inflation could feed on itself at higher levels. And we get inflationary spirals beyond a certain point, people pushing up inflation because they think inflation is going to go up, and it could be a spiral which goes up. So for that reason, we tend to be much more conservative in setting the inflation target significantly below the threshold. So in the received wisdom of today's monetary economics, a central bank serves the economy and the cause of growth best by keeping inflation low and stable around the low target it is given by the government. Now, this contrasts with the previous view that by pumping up demand through dramatic interest rate cuts, the central bank could generate sustained growth, although with the cost of some inflation. That view of the role of the central bank proved hopelessly optimistic and resulted in many cases in significantly higher inflation than the economy could tolerate. Now, given this kind of preamble, I will admit that there is a short-run trade-off between inflation and growth. In layman's terms, if today the central bank cuts interest rates by 100 basis points and the banks pass this on through lower interest rates on the loans they make, demand will certainly pick up. If you get a loan at 100 basis points less than you're paying on your EMIs today, you'll certainly go out and buy more stuff. And we could get stronger growth for a while, especially if economic players in the economy are surprised. The stock market may even shoot up for a few days. But you can fool all of the people only some of the time. If the economy is already producing at potential, we would quickly see shortages and a sharp rise in inflation. Now, some people may expect the central bank to disregard inflation because it has already shown dovish behavior. And if they believe that, they will embed higher inflationary expectations into their decisions, including demanding higher wages. So one set of people, if they believe this is the pattern the central bank will follow, could essentially start off an inflationary spiral. On the other hand, if the central bank says everybody is mistaken, I just cut interest rates because I thought there was room, now I find there's no room, I got to reverse it, the central bank may then be forced to raise interest rates substantially, not just to offset the cut that it did, but also now to signal that you were mistaken about its objectives. It wasn't dovish, it's now more of a hawk. Net effect is, yes, we get growth for a little while, but we get a boom which proves unsustainable and then a bust. And typically, this kind of volatility in growth is not good for the economy, creates substantial damage, and we are much worse off than if the cut had not taken place. That is why, even though there may be short-run trade-offs between inflation and growth, modern economics says there's no long-run trade-off between growth and inflation. If I start cutting interest rates, you will start expecting higher inflation and the spiral will start taking place, and I will not over time get any higher growth. In fact, I may get lower growth as I have to rein in inflation. The only way, or the best way for the central bank to ensure sustainable growth is to keep demand close to potential supply so that inflation remains moderate and all the other factors that drive growth, such as good governance, structural reforms, all those factors can start taking center stage. In other words, the best thing a central bank can do for growth is make inflation a secondary or a tertiary issue, so you don't even worry about it. You're focused on all the other important things that drive growth, such as good management, good governance, and reforms. This is the message that I have been trying to send for the last few years. And what I want to say is that when people say inflation is low, you can now turn to stimulating growth, they really don't understand that these are two sides of the same coin. The RBI can best benefit growth by keeping inflation low and by keeping the policy rate as low as it can, given its objective of keeping inflation low. You can't do better than that. Today, the fact that inflation is fairly close to the upper bound of our target zone suggests that we have not been overly hawkish, and that in fact, we have been wise to disregard advice in the past to cut very deeply. Because today we would have breached our inflation target if in fact we had cut significantly more in the past, given inflation, the inflation target is 6% and today inflation is 5.8. So if a critic of our interest rate policies believes interest rates are excessively high, he has to either argue that the government set inflation target should be higher than it is today, or that the RBI is excessively pessimistic about the path of future inflation. He cannot, however, have it both ways, want lower inflation as well as lower policy rates. You can't do both at the same time. Now, that said, the RBI doesn't focus on inflation to the exclusion of growth. We don't sort of have a monomaniacal view on inflation. Today, if inflation were to rise sharply, for instance, because of a sharp rise in the price of oil, it would not be sensible for us to bring inflation within its target band immediately by raising interest rates so high as to kill all economic activity. That would be too high a cost for the economy to pay. Instead, it makes sense to bring inflation back under control over the medium term. That is, over the next 2 years or so, by raising rates steadily to the point where we think it's enough to bring inflation back within the target range. Now, for those pressed people here, let me emphasize this is not a prediction either of the path of oil prices or a forecast of our monetary actions, lest I read in the paper tomorrow, RBI to raise rates. This is instead a way of saying that we have taken care of concerns about growth by postulating an extended glide path over which we are bringing inflation into check appropriately. And this balances the degree to which we need to work on inflation while understanding that the economy cannot sacrifice too much growth in the process. And this is where what we have been doing. Now, of course, in any central bank undertaking actions, there are a variety of critics who believe we are totally misguided. So let me offer some of their criticisms and see how I can counter them. One criticism, of course, is that we focus on the wrong index of inflation. And I'll come to that in a second. WPI, we focus on CPI rather than WPI. A second criticism is we have killed private investment by keeping rates too high, and somewhat contradictorily, we're also hurting the pensioner by keeping rates too low. Third, monetary policy has no effects on inflation when the economy is supply constrained, and since food inflation is the biggest factor, and since that's because of supply constraints, we should abandon all attempts to control inflation and just let the supply constraints play out. And fourth criticism, the central bank has little control over inflation when government spending dominates. This is what is in the jargon called fiscal dominance, and something that the RBI used to say a lot in the past. So let me come to these 4 criticisms and then move on. First, the wrong index. Now, historically, the RBI targeted a number of indicators called the multiple indicator approach, in which it put a fair amount of weight on the wholesale price index. Now, theoretically, reliance on the wholesale price index has 2 problems. First, it doesn't really represent an index that people experience. You as consumers don't eat wholesale prices, don't drink wholesale prices, don't buy clothes at wholesale prices. You buy them all at the consumer price. Okay? So what the common citizen experiences is retail inflation, which can be quite different from wholesale price index inflation, not just because they move at different speeds, the individual components, but the basket itself is different. The consumer price index basket has a lot more food in it because consumers consume a lot more food. The wholesale price index may have a lot more steel in it because companies buy a lot more steel. The second problem, and this is important because in effect when we're trying to control inflation, we're trying to control what the public sees and experiences. And by keeping their inflation within control, we then limit the extent to which they demand higher wages because they know that they can in fact manage within a small increment in wage. And we prevent the inflationary spiral that would take inflation out of bounds. So it's very important that we focus on the index that people, the common man, experiences, and that's the consumer price index. The wholesale price index that people tom-tom about has no bearing to what the common citizen experiences. You would not be happy if the wholesale price index was at 1%, while the consumer price index was at 10%. And in fact, we have had situations where that was the case. You would be very worried about inflation. So it's important that we focus on what you worry about. Second, the wholesale price index contains a lot of traded manufactured goods and commodity inputs in the basket whose price is determined internationally. It's not about domestic monetary policy, it's about international price movements. A low WPI can result from low international inflation, even while domestic components of inflation such as education, healthcare, food, retail margins, all are inflating merrily to push up CPI. In other words, the world may be controlling inflation, we may not, wholesale price index may not reflect the fact that we're not controlling inflation, while CPI will reflect that fact. So by focusing on WPI, we're focusing on the job other people do, the other central banks in the world. We need to focus on CPI because that reflects the job that we are doing in controlling inflation. So let's put that argument aside. It's really, I think, it's now that we have a reasonable CPI index, we have absolutely no excuse to advocate refocusing on WPI. Now, there are some people who want to go to WPI because it is low today, and thus would mean low policy rates. This is getting causality backwards, right? You want the low policy rate, therefore you say WPI. It's also short-sighted because it's quite possible that when commodity prices rise and global inflation picks up, WPI could well exceed CPI. Presumably at that point they will flip around and say, no, let's focus on CPI. So, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. There is this more subtle argument, and it goes like this. The real interest rate is, of course, the difference between the interest rate a borrower pays and the inflation that matters to them. It is the true cost of borrowing, therefore, in terms of the widgets that they buy or the widgets that they produce. Now, there is a legitimate argument which some people make that when policy interest rates are set to control CPI, and CPI is high relative to WPI, those policy interest rates may be too high for manufacturers who see their product prices. They're producing stuff whose prices aren't moving up very much. And therefore, from that producer's perspective, the inflation they see, the argument goes, is their product price increase, which is more like WPI. And therefore, from the perspective of that producer, interest rates, real interest rates are very high because the inflation they see maybe 0.5 or 1%, which is WPI, while the interest rate is set to control CPI at 6 and 7%. Now, I am sympathetic to this argument, but I think the concern is overblown. And the reason is this, because even if the manufacturers don't have much pricing power on the output side because of global competition, their commodity suppliers have even less pricing power because commodities have been falling even more in prices across the world. So even though a metal producer doesn't benefit because he can sell steel at a higher price, he benefits tremendously because the inputs to his manufacturing, such as coal and power, have fallen in price tremendously. And as a result, for him, the true measure of inflation is the inflation in his profits, which is substantially higher than just the inflation in his output prices. So when producers complain a lot about getting very low price increases for their products, ask them what the price increases are for their inputs. And if they say very low and that their profits are quite reasonable, which they have been if you look at the data over the last few years, their profit growth is quite reasonable even though they're not selling at a higher price, then the inflation that they should be looking at is not WPI, but something significantly higher. A second error, and this is more a error that you see made in some of the financial press by columnists, is to attribute all the components of the interest rate paid by the borrower to monetary policy. Now, this is incorrect for heavily indebted borrowers because a large component of the interest rate that they pay is a credit risk premium that banks charge for the risks that they will be defaulted upon and will not get repaid the principal. Okay? And this credit risk premium is largely independent of where the RBI sets the policy rate. Essentially, banks will say the policy rate is 6.5%. On top of that, I will add my credit risk premium of 7% because I simply don't trust this promoter to pay back. Okay? So when somebody berates us because heavily indebted industrialists are borrowing at 14% interest rate with WPI only at 0.5%, and they argue that the real interest rate they're paying is 13.5%, they're making both the mistakes that I talked about. The first mistake they're making is the credit spread, which is something which is based on the borrower repaying, or I should say not repaying. That credit spread is 7.5%. And would not be significantly lower if we cut the policy rate by another 100 basis points. Second, the inflation that matters to the industrialists is not the 0.5% at which WPI is growing, or the 0.5% at which their output prices are going, but the 4% at which their profits are inflating because their input costs are falling at 5% a year. Okay, so all those numbers don't, I've thrown out a whole lot of numbers very quickly, but the bottom line is, when industrialists claim that 14% is too high, they're probably overstating the case. The real risk-free interest rate that they pay is closer to 2.5% and not the 13.5% that they're talking about. Okay? The point here is that really, rather than complaining about policy rate being too high, it is better to bring down the credit spread. That is the spread that banks have to charge because they really don't trust the borrower to repay. And for that, we have to work very hard in improving the quality of lending institutions, the quality of recovery processes, things like the bankruptcy code, all of which we are in the process of doing, but that takes time. And so let us not get impatient. We need to bring down those credit spreads. That's really most useful for highly indebted industries. Cutting the policy rate by another 25 basis points makes little difference to them. But there's also another player in this that we have ignored so far. Because the policy rate plays a balancing act. As much or as important as real borrowing rates are for the manufacturer, real deposit rates are important for the saver. Many of you have deposits in the bank, and it's no news to you that in the last decade, you've experienced negative real rates over extended periods when CPI has exceeded your deposit rate, right? Now, this is something that a lot of people don't fully comprehend. They get an interest rate of 9%. That money comes into their hands. But if inflation is at 10%, their principal is silently being eroded every year by 10%. The net gain that they get in terms of investment income is negative 1%. They are worse off every year by putting their money in the bank. Of course, holding the money under the mattress would be even worse because they wouldn't even get the interest. But the point is, we were misusing our savers. We were maltreating them, mistreating them, maltreating them, essentially taking them for a ride by giving them negative real interest rates. This is what the West is doing now. But they didn't do it they're not doing it through inflation. They're essentially promising you negative nominal rates. You put your money in the bank, you get out less. We were doing it silently through inflation. They're doing it obviously by giving you a negative interest rate, right? But the net effect is the same. You have no interest in savings. And in fact, when we look at the data, this is what our saver was doing. Moving from investing in financial instruments to investing in real assets like gold and real estate because deposits weren't paying them enough. Now, you know what happens when our savers buy gold? Essentially, we don't produce any gold, they buy the gold from abroad. And as they buy the gold from abroad, we run a larger and larger current account deficit. So the twin effects, savers aren't saving in financial assets, and in order to buy the gold, we have to borrow from abroad. So our borrowings from abroad keep increasing, and we ran larger and larger current account deficits simply because we weren't paying our savers enough. Now, in recent years, we have changed this. Our fight against inflation means that the policy rate has come down to a level which is low. We've moved the policy rate down at a lower pace than we've moved inflation down, which means savers today are now experiencing positive real interest rates. That is, they're getting interest rates that are higher than the level of inflation. I mean, just take an example. You probably have deposits in the bank at 7.25 or 7.5%. Inflation is at 5.8. So you are getting a real rate of about 1.5%. And if inflation comes down as food prices come down, it will increase beyond that. Now, I do get a lot of heartrending letters from pensioners complaining about the cut in deposit rates. But I have to constantly try and explain to them that in fact they're better off today than they were in the past. It's only that we're not silently stealing the money from them by increasing inflation and reducing the value of the deposits that they have. We are explicitly giving them positive real interest rates, and they are in fact better off. The bottom line is we have to play a balancing role as a central bank. We are trying to bring inflation down to a level that it becomes a second-order item in your decisions. But in that process, we have to balance the interests of savers and industrialists. We need both. So at one of my talks, there was an industrialist who clamored for a 4% interest rate on his borrowing. He said, you guys are charging too high an interest rate, I want 4%. When I asked him if he would deposit at that rate in a safe bank, let alone invest in one of his risky friends at that rate, he said no. So he wants at 4%, but he will not deposit at 4%. So who's going to deposit to give him the money that he needs? Nevertheless, after having this discussion, he still insisted on us cutting rates significantly so he would get to borrow at 4%. Unfortunately, as a central banker, I don't have the luxury of being inconsistent. I talked about CPI, WPI, I talked about real interest rates. Let me talk about supply constraints. Some people say, why are you bothering about inflation? You really can't affect it because it's all about food supply and so on. And you're not going to grow food at the central bank, so how are you going to affect food inflation? Now, it is true that food inflation has contributed significantly to CPI inflation. But also, when you look at the details, so has inflation in services, like education services and healthcare services. I don't know what TIFR charges, but it certainly is true that a number of private schools have been increasing their fees every year at a pretty reasonable clip because the demand for education is growing every year, but the supply is not keeping pace, okay? So there is inflation, not just in food, but in a variety of other areas. Now, it is true when our critics say that we cannot control food demand, especially essential food demand. Of course, we don't want to starve people. We don't want to raise interest rates where they can't buy wheat and rice, and that's not our intent. So it is hard for us to control food demand, especially of essential foods. And we also don't have the ability to turn a switch and increase food supply because we don't control the growing of food grains, we don't control the monsoon, we don't control irrigation, we don't control technology. What we can do is control demand for other more discretionary items in the consumption basket through tighter monetary policy. So when there is a sustained surge in food inflation, we can prevent it from becoming generalized inflation where people start demanding much higher wages and we get into the wage spiral by raising interest rates and reducing inflation in the other items. Not in food, but in the other more discretionary items. Again, demand is constrained in order to match supply, and we get inflation to be more reasonable. Indeed, if you look at the most recent data, overall headline inflation may have stayed below 6%, precisely because other components of the CPI basket, such as clothing and footwear, are inflating more slowly than food items. So even though food is going up, other stuff is going up at a slower pace, overall inflation is kept within target. And that's really our objective. Even while we're not trying to control food, we try and control the other items. A last criticism I want to address before I go on to towards my conclusion is that, in the past, the RBI was reluctant to lock itself into an inflation-focused framework because it feared that government overspending would make the task of controlling inflation very, very difficult. This was a reason why we really didn't go into this framework. But the possibility of fiscal dominance only means that given the inflation objective set by the government, both the government and the RBI have a role to play. If the government spends too much, the central bank has to compensate with tighter policy to achieve the inflation objective. And so long as this is commonly understood, an inflation-focused framework means better coordination between the government and the central bank as they go towards the common goal of macroeconomic stability. I certainly do believe that the responsible recent budget did create room for the RBI to ease in April. And that's where you see the coordination playing out, that they have to work together. So the bottom line in all this is that monetary policy under an inflation-focused framework tries to balance various interests as we try and bring inflation under control. And what is important in this is to have a pragmatic rather than a doctrinaire mindset. For example, emerging markets like ours can experience significant capital inflows that can affect the pace of the exchange rate, as the director said earlier, which can also affect financial stability. Now, a doctrinaire mindset towards inflation control would say, hands off, don't even intervene in the exchange rate, while a pragmatic mindset would say, we need to intervene occasionally to reduce volatility and to reduce the possibility of instability. However, despite being pragmatic, the pragmatic mindset would also recognize that the best way to obtain exchange rate stability over the medium run is to bring down inflation to a level commensurate with global inflation. And that's what we've been trying to do. Let's try and take inflation out of the equation, but by taking inflation out of the equation by making it low, we'll also take out exchange rate volatility out of the equation. People will stop worrying about when is the currency going to plummet because over time inflation differentials have built up. And I think we're going towards that. Our currency has been one of the more stable emerging market currencies in the last few years. Now, It is true that the transition from a high inflation economy towards low inflation is never an easy one, and we are in the process of that transition. And the reason is, after years of high inflation, the public's expectations of inflation are slow to adjust downwards. And I think that is true in what we see in India also. We are seeing inflation expectations come down in our surveys. We are seeing the public being more optimistic that inflation will stay low, but it's not happening at a dramatic pace. It's happening at a measured pace. We're also seeing household financial savings increasing as a fraction of overall savings, but still only at a very slow pace relative to GDP. We also have frictions in the interest rate setting market. For example, even though we've brought down monetary policy rates, the rates paid by the government on small savings are significantly higher than bank deposit rates, as are the rates on tax-free bonds. Now, the government has decided in recent months to link the rates on these small savings to government bond rates, but we have to continuously monitor these small saving rates to ensure they don't form a floor below which banks can't cut deposit rates. So everybody has to work at making this process function and for transmission to take place. But it is working. Inflation has come down. Expectations have come down. Yes, inflation has picked up in the last couple of months, but a lot of it is food, while some of the underlying factors are getting anchored at lower levels. So the wrong thing to do at such times is to change course. The problem is, as soon as economic policy becomes painful, we have a whole bunch of clever economists suggesting new, unorthodox, painless pathways. Now, this is not a problem specific to emerging markets, but becomes especially acute because every emerging market thinks it's unique, and the laws of economics operate differently here. In India, at least, we have been consistent over time. I was flipping through a book of cartoons by that great economist R.K. Lakshman, and I found one that indicated the solution for every ill in 1997, when the cartoon was published. The solution then, as it is now, is for the RBI to cut interest rates by 100 basis points. The arguments for this interest rate cut change over time, but the solution never varies. Now, I think if you study macroeconomic policy, as I've done over decades, it tells you to be very wary of economists who say you can have it all only if you try something that is out of the box. Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela have tried unorthodox policies in the recent past with depressingly orthodox consequences. Rather than experiment with macroeconomic policy, which brings macroeconomic risks to our unprotected poor, which they can ill afford, it's better to be orthodox about macro policy and unorthodox about microeconomic policy, such as the policies that define the business and the banking environment. Not only do we have less chance of doing damage if we do something wrong, but innovative policy here may open up new paths around old bottlenecks. So innovate on the microeconomic front, just be orthodox on the macro. Specifically on the micro front, the RBI has been adopting more liberal attitudes towards bank licensing, towards financial inclusion, towards new payment technologies that some of you might be interested in, and to the kinds of institutions that will foster more credit growth. So to conclude, let me get back to institution building. We had gotten used in our country to decades of moderate to high inflation, with industrialists and governments paying negative real interest rates and the burden of the hidden inflation tax falling on the middle class saver and the poor. What is happening today is truly revolutionary. We are abandoning the ways of the past that benefited the few at the expense of the many. And what we require going forward is to embed these institutions that will assure us of sustained low inflation and positive real interest rates. We have to embed it into the economy and ensure that this stays. Now, this requires all constituencies to make adjustments. For example, if industrialists want significantly lower rates in order to invest, and that is a genuine and deserved claim, they have to support efforts at loan recovery so that banks and bond markets feel comfortable lending with low credit spreads. Better to focus on that than to keep clamoring for low policy rates when in fact there's very little room given the inflation target that has been set. Similarly, the central government and state governments have to continue on the path of fiscal consolidation so that they borrow less and thus spend less on interest payments, moving from a regime where real interest rates were negative to a regime where real interest rates are positive does mean some adjustments for large borrowers, including governments. Households will have to adjust to lower nominal rates. They have to recognize that those lower nominal rates doesn't mean they're worse off. They in fact are better off because the real rates they're getting are higher and therefore make their savings more productive. And this is a good thing because they will find it worthwhile to save to finance the enormous investment needs of our economy. But the bottom line is that a variety of constituencies have to make adjustments, and adjustments are always difficult and painful in the short run. But it's extremely important not to get diverted as we build the institutions that are necessary to secure a low inflation future, especially because we seem to be making headway today. The government has taken the momentous step of both setting up a CPI-based inflation objective for the RBI, as well as an independent monetary policy committee, which will determine policy. Now, in the days ahead, as a new governor as well as members of the committee are picked, I'm sure the new establishment will internalize the frameworks and the institutions that have been set up and continue producing a low inflation future for India. Now, the rewards from this will be many. Our currency will be more stable as investors gain confidence in our long-term monetary policy goals, and this stability will only improve as our inflation goals become more credible. Foreign capital flows will be more reliable and increase in the longer maturity buckets, including in rupee investments, as we are trying to do today. And this will expand the pool of capital available for our banks and corporations. The government will also be able to borrow at low rates and will be able to extend the maturity of its debt. The poor will not suffer disproportionately due to bouts of sharp inflation, and the middle class will not see its savings eroded. All this, all this awaits us as we stay the course and build the necessary institutions. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to me.